You're listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We believe the Bible doesn't need to be watered down or cleaned up to be understood. Our goal is to provide a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. I'm your host, Colin Connor. Now, on to the episode.
You know what nobody ever taught me in church? Food has a theology. That's right, food has a theology. Now, don't get me wrong, we prayed before meals, absolutely. We had potlucks in the fellowship hall. We made jokes about overweight Baptist preachers. But nobody ever told me that the very act of eating, the practice of sharing a table, the very stuff on my plate even, that all of that is deeply, profoundly theological. We talked about God's word, we talked about God's love, we talked about God's plan, but we didn't really talk about God's table. And that's a problem, because if you pay the least bit of attention when you read the Bible, you will notice something pretty quickly. God doesn't shut up about food. The story begins in a garden with fruit. It ends with a feast in Revelation and everything in between. And just think about the manna and the quail, the milk and honey, the bread and wine, the fish and loaves, wedding banquets, prodigal son barbecues. Jesus' first miracle, for crying out loud, wasn't to heal somebody, but to make sure that the party didn't run out of wine. What we are starting here today is a mini-series about food and faith and drink and the intersection of all of that. Over the coming episodes, you will hear from many different voices bringing a diverse set of perspectives to this table. But today I just want to lay some groundwork with you. I want to introduce you to the idea that food isn't just fuel. It's not just sustenance. It's not just something we do between the important spiritual stuff. Food is the spiritual stuff. I thought about calling this episode an introduction, but I decided to settle on invitation instead. Because introduction, it sounds like a classroom lecture, and I can already be a little too didactic. So while this will be an introduction to the topic for many of you, as it has been for me over the last few years, every other episode in this series will be a conversation with someone on various aspects of how food and faith intersect. So I want to present this more as an invitation to an ongoing conversation that has been here long before us. We're just now starting to pay more attention to it. So buckle up. By the end of this month, you will never look at a meal the same way again. Let's start with a question for consideration. How does God reveal himself? If you grew up anything like I did, you would probably say, through Scripture, through nature, through prayer, through the still small voice of the Spirit, through preaching, of course. And sure, all of that can be true. But the Bible adds another answer that we leave out far too often. And it's through meals. Think about it with me. The Passover was not just a story of the Israelites leaving Egypt. It was a meal that God commanded. How about the Last Supper as an extension of that? Do this in remembrance. It's a meal. The manna in the wilderness, it wasn't just provision, it was literal daily bread that taught trust. You couldn't hoard it. You had to gather it fresh. It was a lesson you tasted every morning for 40 years. Much like when you go to a local farmer's market and you get fresh ingredients and you realize that they don't last long. You have to savor them. You have to enjoy them in the moment. There is something to be learned there. There is theology, even in our food today. How about one of the most popular stories in the Gospels, the feeding of the 5,000? The only story that is in all four of our Gospels before we get to the events leading up to the crucifixion. That feeding of the 5,000, though, it wasn't just some miracle. It was Jesus very intentionally saying, when I'm here, there's abundance. There's enough. In fact, there's even leftovers. And the Last Supper, that wasn't just symbolism either. Jesus took that Passover meal, the meal that defined Jewish identity, the meal that said God rescued us, and he said, this can be about me too. My body, my blood, this new covenant that we have been looking for. He redefined the entire narrative of deliverance, of salvation, over bread and wine. God speaks through meals. I'm not going to get too much into communion here today because we have done an episode on communion already about a year and a half ago. You can find it's from October, November of 2024, right after Theology Beer Camp. So it's kind of a two-part episode where we recap that year's beer camp and also talk about communion because of what an important part of the week that was for me. So if you haven't listened to that one already, I would recommend adding that in as part of your listening for this series. So communion aside even, the Bible is packed with ordinary meals that become encounters with the divine. Think about Abraham welcoming the strangers in, feeding them, and then turns out that he is hosting God himself. I think of how many miracles and parables throughout the whole of the biblical story center around something as common as food. Even when the resurrected Jesus appears to his disciples, the first thing he says is, "Y'all got any fish?" And then proceeds to cook them breakfast on the beach. See, the table is where heaven and earth overlap. And that tells us something about God's character. God isn't distant, and he's not just abstract. He shows up at the potlucks. He cares about whether you've eaten, just like your grandma. He throws parties. The language of the kingdom is feast language, abundance language. Taste and see that Yahweh is good. Not intellectually apprehend, not rationally deduce that he is good. Taste. It's embodied. It's personal. You have to use your body, your senses. Let the goodness of God hit your tongue. So what does food imagery tell us about who God is? Well, I think the very first thing we have to say is he's generous. Over and over and over. The Psalms say that God satisfies the desire of every living thing. Isaiah talks about a feast of rich food and well-aged wine. Jesus tells parables about banquets where the invitation goes out not just to friends of the family, but to literally everyone. And when the fancy people don't show up, the poor and broken get brought in from off the street. This is not a God of scarcity. This is not the God we see in American Christianity today. A God who rations out just enough for us to get by spiritually and physically speaking. A God who only gives to those who believe the most correctly. No, the biblical God is one who multiplies loaves without stopping to ask about the political beliefs of the people sitting in front of him. Who turns water into the best wine without feeling like he needs to make sure to give a caveat that people don't drink too much of it. It's a God who describes the kingdom as a place where you eat and drink at his table. Do you ever stop and think about that? God could use any description that he wanted to talk about what paradise is like, what the coming kingdom is like, what the ideal world is like. And he uses food imagery. He talks about having a banquet together with people from all over the world. See, abundance is God's default setting. And hospitality, biblical hospitality, that's not the "I'll have you over if my house is clean" kind of thing we're used to here in this country. No, it's radical, it's risky, it's extravagant in its welcome. In the days of Jesus, it looked like washing feet, killing the fatted calf. It's a woman judged by others, pouring out a year's wages in perfume while people complain about the waste. When God describes himself, he uses food. Do you ever notice how much he does that? I am the bread of life. Not I am the instruction manual of life. Not I'm the theological framework of life. But bread. The thing you need to survive every single day in the ancient world. And here's where we really need to pause and deal with something foundational to the rest of this study. Because none of what we are going to talk about in the next month works. None of this theology of food makes any sense unless we first have a good theology of our bodies. If we're honest, a lot of us don't. I grew up in a Christianity that taught me to fear my body. And even if you listening did not grow up or have not been in independent fundamental Baptist circles, this goes well beyond those little niche groups and into the much broader evangelical segment of Christianity, and even beyond that into a lot of Catholic groups as well. I mean, what do we think of with Catholics aside from shame and abuse centered around our bodies a lot of times? That has just kind of become the Christian narrative for most of America. Our bodies are seen as bad. We're supposed to tame them, to shut them out. The body's the problem with everything. The body is where temptation lives. It's the flesh, and the flesh is weak. The spirit is willing. The goal, then, the whole point that we are given is to escape this fallen world, to shed this mortal body and get to heaven. And you know the songs, right? This world is not my home. I'm just a passing through. All that. The body is viewed like a prison. Earth is a sinking ship, and the mission is just to save souls and get out while the whole thing goes up in flames. Here's the thing, though. That theology sucks. In fact, it's basically heresy. The early church fought this battle nearly 2,000 years ago. They were going back and forth with several sects of Gnostics who often taught that the material world is evil and the spiritual world is good, that the body is bad and that the soul is all that matters. And you know what the early church said? They said, no, that's not what Christianity is. That's not the gospel. Because if we look at what the biblical authors actually write, think about literally page 1, Genesis 1. God makes the material world. And he doesn't say, oh, this is where all sin is going to come from. He doesn't say, oh man, I can't wait to destroy this so we can just start all over again in heaven. No, he calls it good. Not tolerable, not unnecessary evil until we get to heaven. Good. He makes bodies and he calls them good. He makes food and says, enjoy this. And then, and here's the kicker, when God wants to rescue the world, he doesn't send a philosophy. He doesn't send a book. He doesn't send a spiritual essence. He sends an embodied Messiah. The Word became flesh. Jesus didn't just appear human. He was human, fully. And sometimes we don't emphasize this enough. And I think it comes out of a place of wanting to respect him and show his divinity and godhood, and that's all well and good. But when it does it to the exclusion of his physical human side, we're missing the point. The point of Jesus is that he was human. He got hungry. He got tired. He got thirsty. He got sick. He had wet dreams. He cried. He bled when he scraped his hands on the carpenter's table. And when he rose from the dead, he didn't shed that body like it was some old coat. He kept it. A physical, resurrected body that is seen eating fish with his friends. See, the story of the Bible doesn't end with us leaving earth for heaven. It ends with heaven coming down to earth. The New Jerusalem descending, God's dwelling place with humanity, a restored creation with a tree of life at its center. Come on, leaves for the healing of the nations. We find healing in food in our scriptures. The message of the Bible is not about escaping the body or the earth. It's about those things being redeemed. It's not about leaving all of this behind for something better in the next life. It is about everything here being made new. And all of that starting now in this life because of what Jesus did. So when we talk about food over these next several weeks, and when we talk about pleasure, because that's going to be wrapped up in it, when food is done well, it is a very pleasurable experience. When we talk about eating and drinking and enjoying the good things of this world, we are not being unspiritual. This is not some other side podcast I'm about to do. This is still on the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered main page because it is about being fully spiritual. It is a side of spirituality that we have missed in the American church. God made us embodied creatures, and God called it good. We really need to stop being afraid of our bodies. We need to throw out the purity culture that so many of us were taught in our youths, that said that our needs, our desires were bad. Those were things that God created us with. Now, can we try to meet those needs in unhealthy and harmful ways? Absolutely. But the fact that we have desires and needs and hungers, those aren't obstacles to holiness. They are part of what it means to be human. And being human is not just what God made us to be, it is what God himself chose to be. Just imagine, you're God. You have a perfect existence. You are above all of the cares and problems of this world. And yet you choose to become human, to become embodied, because without that, you can't fully do what you are trying to do. You can't finish the mission you are trying to accomplish. Don't come in here and tell me that our humanity doesn't have an embodied holiness to it. That's modern heresy, which is just always a rehashing of ancient heresy. It's definitely not biblical. If humanity is good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for us. That's going to be really important for us to remember as we go into this series, because we are going to talk about enjoying life, enjoying food, enjoying drink, enjoying times with friends. But to do that, we need to be able to enjoy. We need to be able to pause and not over spiritualize everything. Not worry about whether or not this meal has some gospel presentation at the end of it, or whether the person sitting across from us is going to get an invite to church before we get up and walk away. We need to just be able to enjoy the moment for what it is. I know for some of us it's hard. For me, it was really hard because it's so counter to the Christian culture that I was raised in. But I promise you, it is biblical. It is right. It is healthy. And we are going to hear so many more stories in these upcoming weeks that I'm so excited to share with you as we learn how to enjoy these moments of eating, drinking, sharing with friends and family, and enjoying feeling those sensations in our bodies. Now, I know some of you are going to ask as we're talking about that, what about fasting though? Doesn't the Bible tell us to deny the body? Well, the short answer is not really. The Tanakh, the Old Testament, doesn't really have much in the way of required fasting. There is, however, the Day of Atonement, one day a year where there was a mandatory fast. Though, of course, as with everything else, that's debated too. If you've listened to the podcast for any length of time, you know there is no simple answer to any part of the Bible. There have been plenty of debates about those relevant passages in Leviticus talking about the Day of Atonement and whether or not fasting was actually required. That goes to some really nerdy things about the words that are used and how a lot of translations in English will say that the people were to afflict themselves or practice self-denial or something along those lines. And so many have taken that to mean fasting, though not all have throughout the history of interpreting that. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds there because the Day of Atonement will absolutely suck you into a whole other conversation really fast. So to try to stay on track here, in Scripture we do see people fasting when they are in grief, when they're repenting, when they're seeking God in crisis. But there's nothing that is mandatory aside from possibly that Day of Atonement. And in the New Testament, we see Jesus fasting in the wilderness. There's a little mention of it with Paul, but there's actually no direct command of thou shalt fast. There's really only one main passage that most people will go to talk about fasting in the Bible, because a lot of Christians will acknowledge that we are no longer under Levitical law, so they don't really point to the Day of Atonement. We're not following that as a holiday, at least most Christians don't. So a lot of times they'll just turn to Matthew 17:21, where Jesus has been talking with his disciples. They were struggling to cast a demon out of someone. He did it quite quickly and then tells them, this kind does not go out except by prayer and fasting. There are several things we could talk about in this one verse alone, but I just want to make a couple of quick points here. Number one, there is still no direct command here. If you look closely in what Jesus says, there's no point where he says, you have to fast. Not even for the really super spiritual important stuff in your life. There's no thou shalt fast. And on the text critical side of things, this is actually a debated verse in Scripture. None of the other three Gospels include Jesus making this statement. And this verse doesn't even appear in some of our earliest manuscripts. So a lot of scholars believe that this was actually a later addition to the text and not necessarily something that Jesus actually said. I realize for some of you listening, that may change how you view that verse. And for others, it may not. Not everyone views text critical issues and debated verses the same way. And for our cases in these studies, I tend to assume if it's been in there for a while, we might as well talk about it because it's at least in some of our Bibles. So I'm going to just proceed with this assuming that it is meant to be there. And if that's the case, it just goes to show that there can be a place for fasting within spiritual practice, but it is not a requirement. And in fact, we have Jesus in other passages seeming to mock or point out the issues of people who make that a big deal in their life. His whole thing seems to be, if you're going to do it, just don't make a show of it. He doesn't mandate it. There's no guilt trips for people who choose not to, or he or even who cannot. That's something that not a lot of churches bring up. If they encourage some sort of fasting, well, that's not always something that people can do medically. So if you choose to fast, that's fine. There is a long religious tradition of it, even outside of Christianity. There is certainly a place for it, but it is a personal choice, not something that is mandated in order to be holier than someone else or to be closer to God. And I mean, just think about it with me. When people criticize Jesus' disciples for not fasting, he didn't say, "Oh, yeah, you're right. They're just not spiritual enough. We really got to work on that." No, he said, "You don't fast at a wedding, man. When the bridegroom's here, you party." Fasting can have its place. I'm not trying to knock it, but it's a tool, not a requirement. And it is always meant to be temporary. You fast so that you can feast. You abstain so you can appreciate better. You deny so you can be reminded of delight. The goal isn't perpetual self-denial. The goal is learning to receive good things with gratitude when they may have become a little too ordinary to us. Now, while we're at it, I want to address another elephant in the room, and that is the biblical relationship with alcohol. This is another thing I'm not going to get too deep into the weeds on right now because we did a whole episode on this as well, roughly about a year ago. We talked through the history of prohibition, a biblical case for wine, the difference between celebration and abuse. So I would also recommend adding that in as part of this mini-series if you would like a fuller discussion of the topic. But here's the TLDR. Alcohol isn't evil. Jesus drank wine. He made wine. His first miracle was making really, really good wine at a party that had already been going on for a while. Psalm says that wine gladdens the heart. And I know some of you are going, but what about Proverbs? Proverbs has all kinds of stuff about alcohol, right? Not necessarily as much as you would think. We go into that in the series again. But the main thing to realize is that Proverbs and other passages of Scripture as well warn not against alcohol itself, but about drunkenness. Just like with anything else, alcohol taken to excess causes problems. But the biblical portrait as a whole is that it is a gift from God for us to use and enjoy within reason. There absolutely are warnings about excess, and addiction is real and destructive. So if it is a stumbling block for you, if you find alcohol to be problematic in your life, then by all means do not do it. But the Bible's posture toward it isn't fear. We need to be clear on that. It is okay to voluntarily choose not to do things in order to make your own personal life better. But we need to be careful not to have this black and white either or mentality where just because something may not work out in my life means I have to police it in everybody else's. The Bible's posture toward alcohol is not one of fear, but of gratitude and moderation. And frankly, if we can't have an honest conversation about this, we are going to keep losing people. Because the world around us sees through our selective prohibitionism. They see us clutching our pearls about a glass of wine while we gorge ourselves at the buffet. They see us condemning bars while we ignore actual abuse happening in our pews. Let me tell you something about the bar. If something isn't good news in a bar, it's not good news. Let me say that again. It's not original to me. I don't know who said it first, so I'm just going to put it out there as an anonymous quote. But if something is not good news in the bar, it's not good news. People are more real in bars, a lot more than they are in church. There's less pretense, less performance. You're just there. And sometimes, a lot of times, that's where the most honest community happens. That's where some of the most honest conversations I have ever had have taken place. Jesus knew that. And that's why he was called a friend of sinners. That's why he got accused of being a drunkard and a glutton. Accusations you don't get if you're not seen out and about enjoying yourself with people. We'll come back to that a little bit later, but I want to make sure we get that out of the way here up front. And I think part of the reason we've had such a poor theology of food in this country is because it can't allow for fear. And so much of American Christianity is about fear. Evangelicalism and fundamentalism are all about the things that are going to come in and try to take your faith away from you. I believe it was Paul Horde that we've had here on the podcast, wrote about how he heard somebody saying that faith felt like a football that they had to clutch in their hands and make sure that no one else stole from them until they got to the goal line at the end of their life. But that's never the way it was meant to be. And food, good food, I'm not just talking about McDonald's. I'm talking about the kind of meal where, yeah, this is like a once in a lifetime. You're out for somebody's birthday or anniversary. It's a really big meal, really expensive, great stuff, and you just have to sit and savor. That is you being in tune with your body. That is you feeling an embodied holiness and faith and spirituality. And you're not feeling fear in those moments. You're not worried about what someone else is thinking of you, or whether or not you've had a little bit too much of the food on your plate. You'll worry about that later, but right now you're just enjoying it. The theology of food is a series of lessons that have been right in front of us, waiting for us to learn from them this whole time. Before we go any further into this study, I want to acknowledge something uncomfortable. Something most of us would rather not think about while we are eating. Here it is. You ready? All eating requires death. I'm not trying to ruin your dinner, I promise, but it is true. Whether you're eating steak or salad, something died so you could live. Maybe an animal gave its life, or a plant was cut down. Even the most careful vegan practices participate in this reality. Insects killed in harvesting, microorganisms destroyed in processing. Life feeds on life. That's how the world works. And that's not morbid, it's profound. It reminds us that we live at a cost. The ancients understood this because the sacrificial system they had wasn't wasteful excess. The meat was eaten. When you brought a peace offering, you shared the meal with your family, with the Levites, with God himself. The smoke went up to God, but the meat fed the community. That's something we miss about a lot of the sacrifices in the Tanakh. We don't understand the culture, and we assume this was all just burnt to a crisp to somehow glorify God. But if you read the passages carefully, the majority of food brought in sacrifice was eaten. And here's what that taught. Life is costly. Eating is costly. You're not supposed to take it for granted. Our modern industrial food systems hide this from us. Our meat comes in plastic wrap, already butchered. We never see the animal. We never acknowledge the death. We eat without recognizing what it cost. But the biblical world, and honestly, most of the world throughout human history, and even a good part of the world today, does not have that luxury. You knew. When you ate that lamb at Passover, you had seen the lamb, maybe even raised it. Its blood marked the doorposts. Its death meant life, literally in Egypt, symbolically after that in every Passover. That's why Jesus' language at the Last Supper wasn't just random. This is my body broken for you. This is my blood shed for you. He was tapping into something deep, something everyone at that table already understood because of the culture they lived in. Life requires death. Eating requires sacrifice. And now Jesus says, I'm the sacrifice. My death feeds you. Not just physically, but spiritually as well. And so the Eucharist makes explicit what every single meal we sit down to eat implies. We live by the death of another. And honestly, that should change how you eat. It should make us a lot more grateful, reverent, and aware. When you eat meat, you are participating in death. I don't say that to make you feel guilty. I enjoy a good steak as much as anyone else. But it is something to be honest and a little uncomfortable about, too. It helps us to remember to honor and to not waste. And even when you eat plants, you are still participating in the cycle of life and death. The grain of wheat falls to the ground and dies, to use Jesus' words. That's how it bears fruit. None of us is above this cycle. We are all a part of it. We are creatures who need food. Our lives depend on the death of other creatures. That's what it means to be embodied, finite creatures. And God entered into that. Jesus ate. Jesus died. Jesus rose. And even resurrected, he still ate. You ever wonder if you're going to eat in the next life? Jesus did. Fish right on the beach. bread in the upper room. See, resurrection doesn't mean escape from embodiment. It means embodiment redeemed, including the reality that embodied life requires nourishment, and nourishment requires death. So maybe before we eat, we should pause and remember something died for this, and that matters. And I know that's hard to have in our modern American mindset where we are so far removed from the land and from farms. There are plenty of documentaries you can find online that show pretty graphically the process of how we get to the food on our table. And it might be good for all of us to just go and watch one of those. It's not going to be the most fun popcorn summer blockbuster you've ever seen, but it could be an important reminder of how entangled our lives are, not just with each other, but even with the animals and the plants all around us. And that's not me talking some modern, liberal, new agey, woo-woo thing over here. That is as ancient of an understanding of food as you can possibly get. It's good for us to remember that. But we are not just here to talk about death. We are here to talk about the life that comes out of it. Because food isn't just theology. It's art as well. Cooking is creative. I don't just mean that in the sense of it takes creativity to be a good cook, but I mean that in the sense of it is a creative act, an act of creation. It is taking raw ingredients and transforming them into something new, something beautiful, something that didn't exist before, and that can now provide nourishment in a way that the ingredients on their own before that could not. Cooking is a way that the final product becomes greater than the sum of its parts. And that doesn't have to just be cooking dinner. It can be cooking in a liquid sense as well. Fermentation, bread rising, wine aging, cheese culturing, kimchi bubbling. Those are processes that require time, attention, and patience. You can't rush those. You have to wait. Jesus used the language of new wine in new wineskins. And he didn't just mean that as a metaphor. It's actually the way it worked. New wine is still fermenting. It is still alive. If you were to put it in an old, rigid wineskin, the pressure could burst it. You need something a little more flexible, something that can stretch and grow with the transformation happening inside. And that is what I hope we will be like as we do this study as well. Because fermentation is a picture of spiritual change. In fermentation, you add yeast. I kind of remember someone saying that the kingdom is like yeast, and how that works through the whole batch. Slowly and visibly, but undeniably, you can't see it happening, but you can see the results. The dough rises, the wine matures. It's alive. Our food is alive, even after we have killed it. Because there are microbiomes, cultures, bacteria, and yeast. And I know some of you right now are going, oh no, I don't want to talk about that. That's gross. But it's reality. We don't even think about the microscopic world living all around us, and yes, dare I even say, within us. We are an entire ecosystem in and of ourselves, of worlds living inside us, of these little microscopic organisms. It's not sterile, it's not controlled, it's not always the most pleasant thing to think about. It is wild and organic and teeming with life. That's why food goes bad. That's why our stomachs can feel bad sometimes. And that's also why sometimes food can taste so good, because it is leaning into and finding creative ways to acknowledge the life within our food. Microorganisms connect us all, and not just in the gross, if you don't cover your mouth when you sneeze, I get germs kind of way, but in the sense that we actually share microbiomes with the people that we interact with every day. We have these little creatures going from one of us to another without ever realizing it. We are connected in ways that we don't ever realize. And not just with people, but with the food itself. Think about it with me. Let's say an animal is killed for your dinner. You eat that animal. Your body then takes in nutrients that were inside of that animal. Things that were actually living and a part of its own body and system. And now it is being used to construct what your body is going to be over the next days, weeks, and month. Because it feeds your body. It helps to create the new cells. We shed our old cells, right? We're like the ship of Theseus. We're a different version of ourselves within every week and month and year. And we are taking that new life that we are going to have from those animals and those plants out of previous life. And then once it is digested in our system and leaves our body, it then fertilizes the earth, which grows new plants, which are eaten by new animals, which get killed to feed us again. I told you it was messy, and some of you really don't like this part of the discussion, but it's important for understanding how much food is more than just what you put in your mouth. Food is a statement. Food is a connection point. Food is transformation. Food is becoming. It's not instant. It's nothing that just you flip a switch and the effect it has on you is done for the day. It's not a clean process, but a real and a living one. Much like spirituality. We want microwave faith. Just like we want microwave food. Something I hit a couple buttons and it's done in 60 seconds. But instead, what God offers us is more like sourdough starters. We want our quick answers, and God offers fermentation instead and says, let's do this as a process together. Remember, food is greater than the sum of its parts. Flour, water, salt, yeast, individually, they're not the greatest. I'm sure you can drink the water, but you kind of don't want to just eat flour, salt, or yeast. But together, given time, they can become some awesome bread. Just like us. Just like the church is supposed to be. Individually, we are limited, and yet together we can create something new, something that couldn't exist alone. And I don't just mean every time you walk inside the four walls of whatever church you choose or don't choose to congregate at, but I mean when people gather together and then do life together, have meaningful conversations, eat good food, drink good drinks. Something greater than what those people were on their own is created. Every time you sit down to eat, you are connecting yourself with the greater story of humanity. When you had breakfast this morning, you were reliant on the person who made the meal. Oh, sure, maybe it was you, but then you are reliant on the person who got the groceries. Again, possibly you. But what about the person who took the groceries from the back of the store to the front? Or the person who unloaded the truck, or the person who drove the truck, or the person who loaded up the truck to begin with, or the person who packaged it at the plant, or the person who slaughtered the animal or harvested the crop, or the person who planted the crop or raised the animal. Or what about the person that they bought the seeds from, or the animals from? What about the rain that fell or didn't, and irrigation kicked in? What about the soil organisms that broke down organic matter into nutrients? The earthworms that aerated the soil, the bees that pollinated the crops, the sun that powered photosynthesis. You never make a meal alone. Sure, maybe you threw a few ingredients into a pan and you cooked for yourself, but you didn't really make that meal. It was dozens, probably hundreds, maybe even thousands of people, and definitely billions upon billions of organisms collaborated to bring it to you on your plate today. And we like to think we're self-sufficient. Like we earned it. Like it's just ours. But the truth is we are radically dependent on nature, on each other, on systems we don't see and can't control, on the grace of God holding it all together. Speaking of grace, saying grace before a meal, if we do it honestly, it's acknowledging this web, this interdependence, this fundamental reality that we cannot live alone. Recently did a short on this for social media. It's on YouTube as well, because we just have this idea of you need to pray before you eat, right? This is what we do. It's all throughout our culture. It's in our movies, for crying out loud. And it's usually this stereotypical, Lord, please bless this food we have in front of us sort of thing, right? But that's not actually what it looks like in the Bible. There is no command to pray for God to bless your food, because he already blessed it. The biblical worldview is that the earth is good. The world is good. Now, yes, we can and often do corrupt it with our poor actions, the ways that we harm ourselves and others, but that doesn't mean that inherently all goodness is lost. There is still good in this world. There is still good in creation. And food is a blessing in and of itself. It does not need to be blessed because it is God's blessing to us. Now, if you look at the feeding of the 5,000 stories, there's 4 different accounts, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and each one's a little bit different. But the general idea we get across them is not that Jesus was blessing the food, but that he was actually blessing God, thanking God for the food that was there in front of them. Because God already blessed it in creation. And as people work to cook it and prepare it and bring it and then share it with everyone else, it was already blessed. So why do we pray before we eat? Well, it's not a requirement. And for some people, I think they would actually do well to stop doing it for a while because it has just become so rote and meaningless. But at its core, the idea of stopping and praying before you eat is not to ask God to bless something that's already good. It is to pause. In the middle of our busy lives, to pause. Think about how fast we eat. We scarf food down. I'm really bad with this. I can eat really fast. I try to be intentional, but I still find myself eating way too fast. Sometimes you gotta do the put the fork down, like actually leave it outside of your hand in between every bite just to slow yourself down. I'm not just talking fast food. We eat in the car. We eat on the run. We eat at work. We've kind of stopped enjoying food. We've kind of stopped pausing. The one thing in our days that slowed us down and made us reflect was the meal. And now we've turned that into yet another part of the daily grind of living in America. If we pray before we eat, let it be for this, to remind ourselves that we cannot live alone. That we are not isolated souls temporarily using isolated, unspiritual, carnal bodies. We are embodied creatures, embedded in creation, sustained by it, a very part of it. Every day, food is a chance to pause and remind ourselves of the greater cosmos around us, the interconnectedness of all people, our dependence on each other and on God and on the earth beneath us. It is a chance for us to slow down and realize how good we have it. Food is meant to remind us of that every single day. 3 times a day if we're lucky. We are creaturely members of a creaturely world, and that is not a limitation. It is our glory. It is how God made us. It is good. But we do need to talk about one other thing here that can make people a little uncomfortable. Because all this talk about food being beautiful and theological, it rings hollow if we ignore the reality that not everyone has access to food. In the wealthiest nation in human history, we still have people going hungry. We have kids going to school without breakfast. We have senior citizens skipping meals to afford medications. Food deserts are real, even here in America. They are entire communities that don't have access to good quality foods at affordable prices. And far too often the church in this country, the people who follow a guy who fed multitudes, who said, "I was hungry and you fed me," well, we've largely been silent about the issue. Well, maybe we'll do a canned food drive at Thanksgiving. Maybe even volunteer at a soup kitchen for Christmas. But we're not asking the deeper questions. Like, why is there hunger in the midst of all this abundance? Why do we waste so much of our food while we have so many people around us starving? What does it mean that our food system might be built on exploitation of land, of workers, of animals? Food justice is not just some political add-on to the gospel. If food is central to the gospel, so is food justice. The prophets would not shut up about it. Amos criticized the people for trampling on the poor and levying high taxes of grain on them. Isaiah berated people for fasting while not sharing resources with people who were involuntarily fasting because they didn't have access to food. Jesus taught that when you are serving food, you should invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind in your community to your table. And the early church actually did this a heck of a lot better than we do. They practiced radical economic sharing. They had all things in common. They would distribute to anyone as they all had need. And no, I am not reading off of a Bernie Sanders political ad. I'm reading from Acts 2. Nobody went hungry. That was the deal. That was what church looked like. It wasn't just charity. It was justice. It was the recognition that the earth is the Lord's, not mine, not some rich person who can buy the most land. It was the abundance of creation that was meant to be shared. That hoarding while others starve is theft of something that belongs to God and that He has given to us to steward well with others. Our modern food systems in America replicate the imperial patterns of Jesus' day. All we care about is making the biggest profit with the least effort on our part, the least money put out, and the most product put out. That's not what God intended. If any of you listen right now are thinking I'm some sort of liberal bleeding heart, go look up the Jubilee year in your Bible. Do a little study on that. See if your politics change at all when you realize that the biblical vision was for the economy to reset every 50 years, where land returned to people who had it stolen from them. Debts were forgiven. Slaves were freed. Because God knew that human systems always drift toward inequality. And so He built in a correction mechanism to make sure that people were not exploited. Isn't it funny that all the things you hear people today saying we need to be biblical about? We need biblical marriage. We need biblical ideas of life and abortion, a biblical sexual ethic, a biblical view of this and that. What about a biblical year of Jubilee? Where's that theology? Where's the politicians who get your vote just because they claim to believe the same thing as you, and yet apparently don't take this part of it seriously? Where's that on their docket? It's missing. Maybe we should start to ask why. You know something else food does? It draws boundaries. It says who's in and who's out. So what do you mean? Well, every culture has food rules, right? Jewish culture has its kosher laws. Islamic culture has halal requirements. American culture has vegan movements and vegetarianism. But also unspoken rules of what you eat, where you eat, who you eat with. These are markers of identity. See, in the ancient world, sharing a meal meant something. It meant alliance, trust, kinship. You didn't eat with your enemies. You didn't eat with people beneath your social class. You definitely didn't eat with sinners. But Jesus says, what if you do? He ate with the tax collectors, the traitors to His people, the sex workers, the ritually unclean, with everyone that the religious establishment had written off. And it scandalized them, just like it still does today. They called Him a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. And you know what? That wasn't just a criticism. It was an accusation that you are what you eat with. And Jesus was eating with the wrong people. But that was kind of the point. The table was a battleground because the religious leaders of Jesus' day had turned the table into a test of purity. You had to eat the right foods, perform the right way, sit with the right people. The table became a tool of exclusion, and so Jesus flipped it. And for Him, the table became a tool of inclusion. Come, all who are weary, sit down and eat. Meals can become acts of social disruption, like when we still invite over a friend who left the church. Even though they don't agree with us, even though they don't believe like us anymore, not writing them off and ignoring them, but seeing them for the human being that they still are and hanging out with them. It can look like eating a celebratory wedding meal with a queer friend or family member who has been excluded from the table by too many religious people. It can look like making sure that not every table you sit at is made up of people looking exactly like you. Think about how many more lives Jesus changed by eating with people than He did by preaching to them. The table does that. It humanizes. It breaks down walls. You cannot demonize someone that you are sharing a meal with. That's because all meals are sacramental. I know this is controversial, so bear with me here. We tend to think of the sacraments, like, capital S sacraments, as special set apart moments, like baptism, communion, and maybe some others depending on your spiritual tradition. And that's all well and good. But what if every meal has the potential to be sacramental? A sacrament, classically defined, is an outward sign of an inward grace. It is a physical thing that communicates spiritual reality. Bread and wine becoming the body and blood of Christ, or symbolizing it, depending on your theology. Water becoming the washing away of sin, metaphorically through the physical stuff, conveying spiritual truth. Food is that. It is meant to be received as a gift, as a grace, as a connection to the giver. When you eat with gratitude, recognizing the interconnection, the farmers, the soil, the rain, the mystery of life itself, that is sacramental. If it isn't, I don't know what is. When you share a meal with someone, when barriers break down over a drink and you see the image of God in the person across from you, that's sacramental. Jesus didn't just make the Last Supper holy. He made all meals potentially holy by his presence at tables throughout his ministry. And I don't say that to diminish the importance of our capital S sacraments in church, but maybe there is something holy in the day-to-day as well. There is no sacred secular divide in Scripture. It's just a matter of where you find the sacred in the secular. Think about the road to Emmaus and how the two disciples didn't recognize the resurrected Jesus. When? Until he started preaching at them? No, he preached the entire trip. He did his version of our TLDR episode. And yet, that still wasn't enough for the people to recognize him. Why? Because Scripture alone won't do it. Preaching at people doesn't always do it. It was when he took bread and ate with them that their eyes were opened. The table is where we see Jesus. And no, I am not saying that every meal is capital C communion. I'm not saying that your Tuesday taco night is the Eucharist. But I am saying that when we gather together, when we share, when we eat with intention and gratitude and love, that something sacred is happening if only we will recognize it. The Celts talk about these thin places. I think I've mentioned them a time or two before on the podcast. Places where heaven and earth are maybe just a teensy bit closer than other areas. I think the table's one of those thin places. I think it always has been. We just need to be attuned enough to notice. What's the best meal you have ever had? Maybe you don't remember the exact details, everything that was a part of it, but the general idea. Maybe it's at least just the restaurant you can remember, or the people you were with, or the main course, or a favorite wine. What was the best meal you ever had? My family and I absolutely love to talk about food. If my wife and I go out to eat somewhere, my mom says to send a picture. Not of us, but of the food that we ate, okay? We like to talk about the food. We want to hear, is this a place that I want to try? Like, what's the best thing that they had there? And we just love talking about food. Yeah, I like that practice because it forces me to actually think about what I'm eating. To think, how am I going to explain this to someone at the end of the week? How can I text about what the flavors are just beyond, oh yeah, the spaghetti was good. I have to get a little creative with it. And those conversations, somehow they're never about fast food. I don't send a picture of my 10-piece McNugget and fries. It's only the stuff that actually makes me pause and think about the moment I'm in. And sometimes it's really good food. Sometimes it's a really good beverage. Sometimes it's really good company. But the stories are never about rushed eating. I have had some good fast food meals because of the people that I have been around. And don't get me wrong, I do love me some McDonald's nuggets and fries. But the best meals are the ones that really make us stop and think. We have such a fast food mindset in our culture. We eat while driving, we scarf lunch down our desks, we scroll through our phones while we shovel food into our mouths without even tasting it. We've turned food into just another thing to fuel us, Calories in, energy out. Optimize efficiency, get it done, move on. And we wonder why we feel so empty. A cheeseburger isn't just the protein and carbs and fat. It's not just nutrition, thank goodness. It's an experience. It's flavor and texture and smell and memory and the people that you are with when you eat it. But we've lost the ability to be present in our culture. We have lost the art of savoring, of pausing, of rolling around the food or the drink on our tongue and trying to get as many flavor notes out of it as possible, and just extending that moment of euphoric pleasure as we taste the very sensual nature of the food that we are taking in. And that's not to guilt or shame anyone who has a busy schedule and has to eat on the go a lot. I get it. Sometimes it happens. Sometimes I do it too. But I can't help but think that if that is the norm, something is wrong. There's a reason that Jesus told parables about banquets, not drive-thrus. There's a reason that God described the kingdom not as a protein shake, but as a feast. You ever notice how many feasts there are in the Bible? Feasts aren't just buffets. They're not just one-time things. They are long, drawn-out occurrences, sometimes going multiple days. Feasting requires time. Think about like Thanksgiving or some other big meal that your family has together, where you know it's an all-day affair. You're popping several bottles, you're taking several plates, and you're going to need a good long nap afterward. Those days require being present, putting down your phone, actually tasting the food in front of you and looking at the people around you. And you know what? That can be pretty uncomfortable. For some of us more than others. I tend to be pretty introverted, so I get the discomfort for sure. Because when we slow down, we have to feel things. The therapist in me wants to call out the busyness of our culture, the go, 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 and how I can't help but think that some of why we do that, some of why we keep feeding that by going into social media instead of our thoughts, by turning on the TV instead of a book, by putting on headphones instead of just silence, is because when we slow down, we have to feel things, and we are scared of what we will feel. But to fully enjoy the life that God has given us, we need to learn to be present in our bodies and to connect with the bodies around us. That's the point. That is where life happens. And again, this has been in the Bible the whole time. We've just missed it. Think about Jesus' parables: the sower and the seed, the wheat and the weeds, the mustard seed, the yeast and the dough, the wedding banquet, the great feast where people make excuses why they couldn't come, the workers in the vineyard, the prodigal son, the rich man Lazarus, the fig tree. All of those include stories of food. And how many of God's revelations happen around food? Quite a few, a shocking number. The burning bush happens while Moses is shepherding. God appears to Abraham while he's eating with visitors. Joseph interprets dreams about grain and famine and becomes second in command of Egypt by managing food distribution. We've already talked about the Passover, the manna, the quail. How about Elijah fed by ravens? The widow's oil and flour that never ran out. Elijah feeding 100 men with 20 loaves. What about Jesus' temptation? Turn these stones to bread. We already talked about his first miracle and his last meal, and then his resurrection appearance, where he asks about the fish. The Bible begins with eating. And it ends with food in the new creation. The tree of life found again, bearing 12 kinds of fruit this time. The marriage supper of the Lamb, eating and drinking in the table in the kingdom. From Genesis to Revelation, food is everywhere. And yet somehow it feels like we have totally missed it. We've spiritualized it away. We've turned it into a metaphor and missed the scandalous materiality of it all. God cares about food. God cares about eating. God cares about hunger and satisfaction, and whether you are enjoying the good things of this life and whether you are sharing enough of the good things that you have with the people around you who have less. That is not unspiritual. That is the whole point. And again, the early church got this. Church history has understood this. It's more modern times that we have removed this as we have become more removed from how food was made. The early church had these agape feasts, love feasts. They would gather for a full meal before having this little moment of communion. Everyone brought what they had. The rich and the poor ate together. It was a foretaste of the kingdom. In fact, Paul had to correct the Corinthians because some people were getting drunk and stuffing themselves at these feasts while others came in late and were hungry. The problem wasn't the feast, it was the inequality. We have that right in our New Testament, right in the passages that we go to whenever we take communion, and yet we've missed that. Or have you noticed how some of the best beer comes from Christian monasteries? Trappist monks still brew beer today because fermentation takes patience and care and attention, monastic virtues. Christians all throughout the last 2,000 years of history have understood that there should be moderation, yes, but there should also be feasting. There should be sharing. There is an integration between soul and body. The theology of food is not just some modern invention. People have been thinking about, writing about, talking about this for 2,000 years. It's just now making its way into the broader evangelicalism of America. And you know another reason why I think it's taken us so long? Because of how connected feasting is with resting. We don't rest well in our culture. And yet rest is very important to God in our Bibles. He himself rests after creation. And when he's laying down a set of instructions for how the Jewish people could create a utopia centered around how God wants humans to live, he required them to take a day off each week. To worship and go to church, right? No. To rest. And you know what resting included? Eating without working for it. On the Sabbath, they didn't cook. They didn't labor. The food was prepared beforehand. You'd gather, you'd eat, you'd enjoy. See, rest is not about productivity. It's not about efficiency. It's about receiving. And there's no place for that in our modern capitalist consumer economy. That's the enemy. And yet it's a priority that God places, which should maybe tell us something about how unbiblical our quote-unquote Christian nation is. See, the Sabbath teaches us that you don't have to constantly be producing to be a valuable member of society. We are more than just workers. We are not defined solely by our outputs into society. We are, what's the saying? Human beings, not human doings. And being human includes eating and drinking and celebrating. In Jewish tradition, the Sabbath is a time for special foods and good drink. It was a day of enjoyment. And yet Christians have come along and replaced that with Sunday church, which is the opposite of a day of rest. And we've added this whole set of restrictions. Do this, don't do that. Can't tell you how many pastors I've known who have required their families to shut off all devices at a certain point on Saturday night just so they can prepare their hearts for Sunday worship. Now, I am all for taking some time away from devices. We should do that more often. But the Lord's Day was not about being ascetic and removing all of our entertainment. If anything, it was the exact opposite of that. The point of the Sabbath was always freedom. Freedom from the tyranny of productivity. Freedom to enjoy creation. Freedom to feast. Rest and feasting go together. You cannot truly rest if you are still anxious, if you are still working, if you're still hustling. And you can't truly feast if you're rushing through the meal to get through the next thing. Sabbath tells us to stop. Sit down. Eat the bread. Drink the wine. Actually taste it. Taste how good it is. Remember that you're loved and you're worthy, not because of what you produced, because today you didn't produce anything, just solely because you exist. Every week, God built into this ideal society, you are not a machine. You are a creature who needs food and rest and celebration, and we as Christians have completely turned that upside down. We have made that day about just another day of constant work and hurry and optimization. We've just slapped God's name on it. Really, I feel like maybe we were slapping him instead. Sabbath is a weekly practice of being creatures instead of being the pretend gods we think we are, and eating is a central part of that. Necessary, delightful, embodied part of that. We missed a good theology of celebration here in America. Oh, sure, we know how to be somber. We got that Protestant work ethic. We know how not to smile when we're in church. We know how to be reverent. We know how to be serious and disciplined and self-controlled. But do we know how to party? Do American Christians know how to party? Are we going to be ready for heaven? All these songs we sing about just falling down at the feet of God and worshiping Him forever, I'm like, you do realize that's a very, very, very tiny part of what the next life is supposed to be. Well, there's some worship, sure. Oh, there's definitely work, too. There's a lot of feasting, though. A lot of partying. Because that's central to the Bible. Y'all know Purim? The Jewish holiday celebrating the story of Esther? There's a tradition in some Jewish circles that would certainly not be welcome in most Christian ones. And it's that at the celebration of Purim, as you remember the freedom, the salvation that God has brought to you and your family and your heritage, that you should drink so much that you cannot tell the difference between the words blessed be Mordecai and cursed be Haman by the end of the night. That is the kind of biblical celebration we are talking about. The Psalms tell us to make not just a noise, not a worshipful noise, not a reverent noise, a joyful noise. You ever notice how much white people don't like noise? Oh, and I'm right up there too. I don't like a bunch of background noise. I don't like when a room is too noisy. But you know what a noisy room means? It means images of God are there. And it means that they are enjoying conversation with other images of God. And chances are they're probably enjoying some food, too. Maybe some good drinks. It makes me think of being at a Philly sports game. And when we score, the whole place goes crazy. And it can be just the middle of the season, game that doesn't matter for anything. And when we score, you would think it's the playoffs. We go nuts. It is not a pleasant sound. But it's a good sound. It's a joyful sound. It's an embodied sound. It's a messy sound. It's a spiritual sound. It's a biblical sound. Because it's partying. It's celebrating. It's like David dancing before the Lord with all his might while his wife criticizes him for being undignified. I know some Christians like that. They'd get along well with her. Not so well with David. And definitely not with Jesus, who turns water into wine at a wedding and who tells parables about parties. Because somewhere along the way, we got scared of joy. We got scared of pleasure. We got scared of letting loose and just having a good time. Don't get me wrong, we overindulge all the time here in this culture, but we don't enjoy it. We eat so much and taste so little. We drink to escape and not to celebrate. You know, there's a difference between gluttony and feasting. Gluttony is mindless. It's disconnected, alone. Feasting, on the other hand, that's intentional. It's communal. It's grateful. You can be gluttonous, eating and drinking less than you do at a feast if it is about numbing yourself rather than enjoying what is in front of you. It is not about the quantity of the food or the drink. It is about the quality of the experience. We need to recover not just the art, but the theology of celebration. The permission to enjoy good things without guilt. The freedom to say God gave us taste buds and wine and laughter and music and great food, and tonight we're going to use it all. If we cannot celebrate, we can't truly worship. Let me say that again. If we can't celebrate, we can't truly worship. Because worship isn't just solemn hymns. It's dancing and feasting and shouting and joy. The kingdom of God is a frickin' party, and we're all invited. Remember, you don't get accused of being a glutton and a drunkard if no one's ever seen you out partying with your friends. And isn't it funny that Jesus doesn't actually deny their claims there? He doesn't say, actually, I'm very moderate and restrained, thank you very much. Can't you tell I'm a Protestant? No, he leans into it. He basically says, yeah, John came fasting and you said he had a demon. I came eating and drinking and you call me drunk. You fundamentalists are impossible to please. Jesus wasn't apologetic about enjoying the life that God gave him. And this matters because we have made Christianity into a religion of restriction and joylessness. We have made it about what you can't do, of what you shouldn't enjoy, of what you need to give up. But Jesus, he wasn't accused of that. He was accused of enjoying life too much. Maybe we should be a little more like Jesus. So let's end this episode today the best way I know how, with a story about poop. Some of you may have heard me tell this before. I distinctly remember one time when I was a kid in church having a guest preacher in, and I don't even remember what passage he was talking about. In fundamentalist circles, it didn't matter. We had the same points we would get to, or it would just be a rant about whatever was on his mind. The passage was really secondary. We made sure we mentioned it first, so the whole thing sounded biblical, but really it was just a vessel for whatever the preacher wanted to say. And he was going off on how he did not believe that we would be eating much at all in eternity, because he just could not fathom that a resurrected body could poop. He was sure that whatever food we ate would just be the exact right amount of nutrients that our bodies needed, and there would be no waste whatsoever. That's right, folks. Homeless people on the streets, unnecessary wars going on in the world, abuse happening within church, and we decided to argue about whether or not you had to go to the bathroom in heaven. As ridiculous and extreme as that story is, I think it serves to show us the way that a lot of Christians view the afterlife. They have this vague idea that heaven is just spiritual and ethereal, and maybe they haven't thought about it in such graphic detail as that particular preacher did, but they imagine disembodied souls floating on clouds, singing forever, and eating? I mean, that's for this life, right? That's for the body, and the body's what we're leaving behind. But that's not what the Bible teaches. In Revelation 21 and 22, we see the New Jerusalem coming down from heaven to earth as God dwells with us again, just like in Eden. It's a new creation, a renewed Eden. There's a tree of life with 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month, with leaves for healing of the nations. I know I've already said this, but I am bringing it up again because I am assuming that I am probably working against years of borderline heretical indoctrination from preachers that this world is not your home and you're just a passing through. So I'm going to say it again. The new creation includes eating. Jesus, in his resurrected body, ate fish. He wasn't pretending. He wasn't accommodating the disciples' confusion. He was demonstrating this is real. This is embodied. This is your future. The marriage supper of the Lamb, that's not just a metaphor. It's a feast, an actual meal with the resurrected Messiah and all of his people throughout history. Eating is not just for this fallen world. It is part of the restored creation, which means that everything that we have been talking about, the theology of food, the sacredness of meals, the joys of eating, it's not just temporary. This is not just some concession to our weak physical bodies. This is a forever practice that we get to engage in now. God likes eating. He created eating. He thinks it's good. So good that even in the new creation, when everything is redeemed, restored, perfected, we will still gather around tables. We'll still share meals. We're still going to taste and see. The story begins with food in a garden and it ends with food in a garden city. Eden had the tree of life, and we were meant to eat from it forever. And yes, our failures blocked access, but in the new creation, the tree's back. And this time there's nothing blocking the way. 12 different kinds of fruit. You ever catch that? A harvest every month. That's abundance without end. That's the future we're headed toward. Remember how I said earlier, if it's not good news in the bar, it's not good news? Well, if all of that is our future, how should we live now? People are more real in bars. You're not trying to perform. You're not trying to impress anyone. You're not putting on a show. I guess maybe unless it's karaoke night. But you're just there, right? You're present. You're human. And that's where honest community happens. Where real conversations happen. Where people drop the facade and admit they're struggling. And they ask questions that they never ask in church. Jesus knew that. And that's why he was most comfortable in those kinds of spaces. That's why he ate and drank with the people the religious leaders avoided. Because the gospel isn't for the respectable. It's not for the people who have it together. It's not for those who pray the right prayers and eat the right foods and stay in the right spaces. The gospel is not for those people. Gasp, how dare you? The gospel is for everyone. Yeah, except the guy that started this whole thing said that those who are whole don't have need of a physician. If you think you have the good news in having already believed everything exactly how you needed to believe it just so, what good is good news for you? Good news matters to people who need to hear it, to real people, to people who are actually being themselves, not to people who are trying to make you think they don't actually need it because they have on their Sunday best and their smiles and their quiver full of kids all tucked neatly in a row next to them. The good news isn't for the people already sitting at the table. The good news is for the people who have been excluded from those tables by people who think they already have the good news. And so if we use food and drink to exclude people, to make them feel judged at our literal table in front of us, or unwelcome, like they have to be a different person before they can have a meal with us, then we've missed the whole point. Jesus set a big table, a scandalously inclusive table, a table with sinners and saints sitting side by side, where the wine flowed and the bread was broken and everyone was welcome. That is the kind of table that we are called to set. Not a table of judgment, not a table of rules and restrictions, but a table of abundance and welcome and joy. Because at the end of all of this, that's exactly the kind of thing we're headed for. Blessed are those who are invited to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And by the way, everyone's invited. So everyone's blessed. That feast, that celebration, that party that never ends. If we are going to live in light of that future, we need to start practicing it now in this life. We need to start setting real physical tables and sharing meals, not just with our best friends, not just with our families, not just with the people who have the same skin color or the same political leanings or the same social status we do. We need to start breaking bread with people who are different from us. We need to celebrate the good gifts of God without guilt or fear. We need to recover a theology of food and drink that is grounded in Scripture, rooted in incarnation, oriented toward justice, and unafraid of joy. Because food is not just fuel, my friends. It is theology. It's art. And it is life. And every time we eat together, every time we pause and give thanks and share what we have, we are participating in something sacred, something that echoes the very first meals in Eden and anticipates the ultimate feast in the new creation. So the next time you sit down to eat, pay attention. Taste the food. Look at the people around you and remember the web of life that brought your meal to you. And give thanks. Not because the food needs blessing, but because you need a reminder that it and you and the world around you are already blessed by God. You need to remember that you're not alone, that you're not self-sufficient, that you are part of something bigger. And that something bigger, it's a good thing. It's abundant. It's generous beyond measure, just like the God who made it all. So here is what you have to look forward to in the upcoming episodes. I'm just going to let you in on a little secret. These are some of the best episodes that I think we have ever done. I am more excited about sharing this next month of content with you than I have been in a long time. I always feel bad when doing a podcast like this and you have a guest on or something, you say, we have a very special guest. And I always think, well, what about all the other guests? Like, if you say that every time, is it still special? So I usually try to avoid that kind of language, but I really, really am excited about what we have upcoming. Over the next month, you are going to hear from brand new guests for the podcast. None of them have been on before, and they all are bringing something special to this conversation about the intersection of faith and food and drink. We're going to start off next week with Asia Dorsey. She is a podcaster. She is an herbalist. She is like a little bit of everything. She has her hands in so many pots, literally and metaphorically. But such an insightful person who has so much to teach us about embodiment and fermentation and celebration. That's going to be really unique, probably unlike anything you have ever heard before. So she's really going to, no pun intended, set the table for everything else that we're going to be talking about as well. It's kind of going to be like a continuation of today as you hear it from somebody else's perspective, and she's going to bring so much awesome wisdom to that. And then we're going to have on Ben Price, who is going to talk about, well, a little bit of everything. You're just going to have to wait for that episode. But oh my gosh, we go all over the place in that conversation in the best way possible. It was so much fun. It's going to be the longest of the interviews here, and I just feel like we probably could have easily doubled it. We just could have kept talking. But he has a lot of experience with beer especially, so he's going to bring in some conversation about that, and then also about what he calls the feral spirit of God. He has a lot to teach us about not being so rigid, but just living life and enjoying the wild messiness of it all. Then we have Andrew Camp from the Biggest Table podcast coming on, and he is going to bring in some of his experience as a professional chef and also a wine rep and a former pastor, and we're going to hear about how all those worlds collide. So he has some awesome insights about food and wine and faith that I know y'all are going to love. We just finished editing that episode recently. I think it's one of the most down-to-earth in the whole series we have done. It is super, super practical. And then we are going to have on the wine pastor himself, Jeremy Jernigan, who was also a former pastor and loves the intersection of faith and wine, but he's going to take it a little bit of a different direction than Andrew did. We're going to talk about some important Bible passages that talk about food and drink and faith, and we're even going to get a preview of an unreleased book that he has coming out soon. And then we will be finishing out the series with Anna Rollins, author of the new book, Famished, on food, sex, and growing up as a good girl. She has some really personal stories and experiences to share that will show, despite everything we have talked about today and will talk about in the next weeks, there is a dark side to food as well, and particularly how women especially are getting very mixed and negative signals about what their relationship to food should be. Not just in the dieting culture of the world around us, but also within church, and especially due to purity culture. It is a fascinating angle on the topic that I really wanted to make sure we brought in as well to help round out this discussion and show it is not black and white. Even though food and drink are a gift, they can be used as weapons as well, and not everyone experiences their goodness in the same way. That is going to be a really important conversation to keep us thoughtful of other people's perspectives and experiences. So that is an incredible lineup we have over this next month. I cannot wait for those episodes to debut. I hope you will enjoy them and learn from them as much as I did. That is all that we have for today. I hope this gave you a foundation for a whole side of theology that has always been there, but probably has not been emphasized for you in church the way that it was meant to be. And I hope that this is going to not just change your view of the Bible and this theology, but also of the meals that you have every single day. I know that's a big ask, but I'm pretty confident we can make that happen over the next month. And as always, we'd love to hear from you. Feel free to write in on our website, email cconn@thebibleuncut.com, comment on our socials on YouTube. You can hop in our Discord. We have the links to all of that in the show notes. All right, friends, we will talk next week. But for now, go find something delicious. And be sure to take the time to pay attention and savor it. And maybe even share it with a few friends while you're at it. Until next week. Stay curious and keep asking questions about the uncut and unfiltered Bible.
You've been listening to the Bible Uncut and Unfiltered. We hope we provided a healing place to discuss the questions you can't ask and the context you won't learn in church. If you enjoyed the podcast, would you take a minute to share it with a friend? You could also rate and review on your podcast app. If you'd like to donate to keep our work going, you can go to our website, thebibleuncut.com, and click on the Support Us tab. While you're there, check out the recommended resources and blog where we post show notes and other articles. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.